Hello everyone. So, we covered the summary of week 1 to week 6 in the last session, and this which is eventually going to be the last final session for this course, we will be covering the summary from week 7 to week 12. So, in week 7 we had discussions over economics of water projects. As the economic analysis helps in decision making, especially when there is limitation of resources. So, which way the resource should be allocated or what kind of resource utilizing schemes or projects can be considered. So, this kind of decision, how economic principles or how economic analysis helps in decision making, that is what was discussed. If we see the price theory, which is relevant where markets are operating efficiently, and the welfare economics, where the prime objective is to maximize the human welfare within the available resources. So, both tend to fail at times because they have their own limitations. The price theory basically will work if water is used only for the competitive purpose, but there is a lot of social aspects involved, whereas welfare economics does not appropriately consider the value of water, as it is more intended towards the optimization of the welfare of the society or human welfare. So, both have their own limitations and they tend to generally focus the static analysis, whereas the financial analysis considers the time value of investments and decision. So, at time could actually work out better as compared to these. The output from water projects may vary in its type and time scale, and that is why it needs to be normalized when we compare the output from different options or different projects. A project may give output in terms of social benefits or may give output in terms of monetary benefits. Now, it becomes very difficult to compare the monetary benefits with the social benefits. So, in such cases the a normalization is needed where all sort of quantifiable as well as non quantifiable consequences whatsoever are there are converted into the commiserable units. So, for example, somehow we have to have an assessment of the social benefit also in terms of, let us say, rupees or dollars, that kind of units, based on which we can actually compare the things. It should be normalized on time scale also, because investment in the date of today and investment after, let us say, 5 years is not going to have equal value. Similarly, return after 2 years and return after 10 years, even if their net amount is same, but their value will be different because the time value of money changes. So, that is why this normalization is essential, and the steps for normalization or steps for investment analysis of these projects, which includes the identifying different alternatives and associated cost. So, that first needs to be identified what are the different alternatives and what cost, what will be the related cost to those alternatives or those projects. Then one need to predict the quantifiable as well as non quantifiable consequences, convert them into the appropriate units, normalize them for time value of money using appropriate discount rates, conduct risk analysis for alternatives, and then ultimately choose the best among the alternatives which can be obtained from the cost benefit criteria. The financial benefit cost analysis, which has a unit of the project, it does not have a unit of the entire water sector or the resources. That way it is done on a unit of the project basis, and therefore, if the project needs any additional investment or if the option needs any additional investments, what are going to be the additional return over that. So, additional benefits and related additional cost can also be compared using a incremental benefit cost analysis method, which was discussed. Then numerically, the consumer's demand may be considered as a function of its income and price. We had discussion over that model where the demand can be put as a mathematical function of price and income, and that can be that mathematical function can be actually optimized based on the price and income to result in an optimum demand. So, this further it should be, the demand should be considered real when it is accompanied with the willingness to pay, which can be estimated using direct method or indirect method or various proxy measures which was discussed. The response of consumers to the change in prices, whether if change in price, if price is going to change, how the demand is going to be affected is reflected in the price elasticity of the demand. Obviously, with the changing price the demand is going to be reduced. So, that way the price elasticity of demand is often negative. This is the price elasticity of demand is which is given as a slope of the demand function in fact. So, this can be this price elasticity of demand also indicates whether the demand is elastic or inelastic depending on its absolute value less than 1 or greater than 1. This demand, supply and willingness to pay functions can be used for obtaining consumers and producers surplus as well. So, the consumer surplus means if my willingness to pay is higher and I am getting the commodity or services at lower price. So, that is called consumer surplus, and producer surplus is whatever the benefit producer is giving, means whatsoever is the producer's cost over whatsoever is the price he is getting for that. So, the difference is actually producer surplus. So, all this thing can be determined using the standard curves as discussed in the week 7. So, the next week, the week 8 discussions were focused onto the economic evaluation of water projects, where primarily the different economic evaluation or capital budgeting techniques were used for the economic evaluation of projects. So, economic feasibility of projects should be evaluated based on the reliable estimates of all economic benefits and cost of the projects. That is very important aspect, because if the generally the evaluation for this project is done at a prior stage with the estimated values of the benefits and cost. So, if those estimated values are not reliable, the entire evaluation may lead to the misleading result, and that is why it is very important to have the reliable estimates of all the benefits and cost for the project. Obviously, if benefits exceeds, the project is considered to be economically feasible, while if cost exceeds over benefits, the project will be considered economically unfeasible. Generally, because the water projects are long term investment with high capex, so and involves tangible as well as non tangible assets, the feasibility of allocation of funds could be evaluated using the capital budgeting techniques. There are for independent project, the proposals, if there are multiple proposals, multiple independent proposals, whosoever passing the criteria can be accepted because of their independent nature. But for mutually exclusive project, even if several projects is basically passing the criteria, because the nature of the project is mutually exclusive, so only one can be selected. So, the project which is the most rewarding is selected, whereas all other projects, even though they are economically feasible, but they gets rejected. Among the capital budgeting techniques discussed, the payback period, which is the most simple to use, it only estimates the time in often in terms of the number of years, or how many years and how many months investment is going to be investment is going to be recovered in fact. okay, from the future incremental cash flow. The major problem is that it does not consider the time value of money. So, that is the major drawback for payback period, but its simplicity is the one which is which sort of popularize its use, and many companies and many people use it still because of it is the most simple. Then if we look at the other methods, the net present value or NPV, which is the difference between the market value of the project discounted to the present minus its initial outlay, that is one method. Then there is internal rate of return, which is primarily the geometric average return on a project, or the benefit cost ratio or profitability index, which is the ratio of the present value of the future cash flow discounted to present time with the cash outlays. So, these are the other commonly used methods, relatively popular methods, which considers time value of money also. The net present value and benefit cost ratio are relatively easy to estimate, because all one needs to estimate the discounted cash flow as specific fixed rate of discount, and then divide it with the, either subtract it or divide it with the initial outlay, depending on whether we are computing NPV or benefit cost ratio. While IRR is estimates the rate using trial and error, because the rate is not known. So, the different trial and error steps needs, and that makes this as a calculation intensive. So, this is the basic advantages and disadvantages. The details with the examples were discussed during the week 8. However, even though IRR is calculation intensive, the financial institutions like banks and the financing agencies like to know the return on their investments, and therefore, many times they prefer this internal rate of return. Among the capital budgeting techniques, primarily the IRR and net present value, which are more commonly used, or even other techniques, they commonly give the same decision or reflects the same decision for independent project, but could lead to the conflicting or misleading decisions in while one needs to rank the different project if the projects are of mutually exclusive nature. So, this for ranking projects there could be conflict in the decisions, and these conflicts could arise basically if there is a differences in the scale of investment, or the timing of cash flow, or the age of the project. So, if those are the different, then this kind of ranking conflicts are often seen, and in such cases it has been seen that generally NPV may prove better than IRR for decision making under such projects. So, this was the discussions over week 8. The week 9 onwards, we focused more on to the governance aspect, governance including the basic governance tools, then governance practices in India, and the subsequent weeks focused on to the dispute resolution and international mechanism on water cooperation or water diplomacy. So, week 9 we discussed the general concept of water governance. So, how the governance refers to the set of political, social, economic and administrative systems that control the decision making basically. So, governance is more related to the decision making process, and as we discussed during the week 9 that governance primarily focuses on to the who is making the decision, how the decision is being made rather than the decision itself. Okay. So, the typically it also the water governance capacity in a nation reflects its level of competence, how competent the nation is in implementing effective water management schemes through policies, law, regulations and its sort of compliance mechanisms. For managing the water challenges, effective water governance is needed with a balanced approach towards the different different dimensions of the governance, which could range from social, economic, political or environmental dimensions. And the OECD have given 12 guiding principles which were discussed in the detail during the week 9, which targets essentially towards enhancing the effectiveness. So, there are 4 principles guided on to the enhancing the effectiveness of the governance, then other 4 enhancing the efficiency of the water governance, and then there are other 4 which targets enhancing the trust and engagement in the water governance. So, those are the 12 OECD principles which were discussed in detail back in week 9. Then the different governance model also discussed, where distributed governance is usually more preferred over hierarchical or market led governance for the water issues, because the issues are often more localized. So, the hierarchical governance which takes a top down approach becomes very difficult for central agencies to manage the local issues, and market led governance, since rely more onto the market principles or private involving private sector. So, that has its own limitation, and those are the issues related to such governance models. In general, the many experts in the world or many people in the water sector, many implementing agencies on national states are promoting the integrated water resources management, which is IWRM, which sort of promotes the coordinated and integrated development and management of the water. So, that is one model which was also discussed, and eventually the benchmarking of water governance, because of its importance in assessing the state of the water resources management, the effectiveness of the water governance policies. So, in order to compare that, in order to benchmark with the standard, one needs to basically devise the performance indicators. So, various performance indicators which are generally commonly accepted for good governance. So, those performance indicators can be used for the comparison and benchmarking of the water services. In the week 9, week 10 we discussed the water governance aspects in India. Okay. So, how our constitution authorize the different agencies for water governance, what are the common general practices adopted over water governance was discussed in week 10, excluding the disputes which were again discussed in week 11 though. So, it was discussed that many experts actually opinion that the water crisis in the Asia region or the Asian countries is more due to poor governance than the physical scarcity of water, and this essentially highlights the role of the governance in water sector. The governance had due attention even in the ancient India, and the knowledge of hydrology and water resources engineering was deep rooted back then. That is reflected from the old structures which were made for the water management purpose, different purposes of water management, and some of those structures or some of those practices which are very localized, state to state dependent, were discussed during week 10. According to Indian constitutions, our water is a subject of legislation at 3 different levels, where the central government mainly looks at the interstate river and interstate water disputes. It is the state bodies which have major authorities over the management and control of the water, who manages the policy and regulation on water supply, irrigation and canal, drainage, embankment, water storage, water power. So, all these important aspects, it is the state government who basically holds the authority, as were discussed that water which is listed in the 7th schedule under list 1, which is under the purview of the central government, only interstate and rivers and interstate water dispute is listed, while the major services related to the water or the management of the water is listed under the list 2, which is under the purview of the state's authority. The local bodies have the responsibility of implementing these schemes which is made from the state government, and ensuring water supply and sewerage systems. Various commissions like Sarkaria Commission, Panchi Commission, all those was established from time to time in order to review these constitutional provisions, or with the idea of whether water should be a subject under central, but all such commissions actually recommended that water management except interstate water allocation and dispute, which is already under the purview of center, should be states subject, and that is how the constitution is. So, many of them actually were of the opinion that whatever is mentioned in the constitution is probably the best way to manage the water, or best way to distribute the authorities to manage the water. Then there is a series of water program and policies have evolved since independence, and most of them emphasize on the improving of water supply and sanitation services, effective management of irrigation water and groundwater protections. In India, it is the National Water Policy of 2012, the recent one. Earlier there were a couple more national water policies. So, it is the National Water Policy of 2012 and various state water policies, which generally work as a guiding documents on water governance. In terms of institutions, we have two central institutions, the Central Water Commission, which is CWC, and the Central Groundwater Board, CGWB. So, these are the institutions which are central agencies which looks the management of surface water and groundwater resources in the nation respectively. There are various key scheme and reforms are underway. There is river interlinking, the National Mission for Clean Ganga, National Hydrology Project, zero liquid discharge enforcement by the Central Pollution Control Board. So, all such projects are improving the water management and governance practices in India. However, most of these are actually underway. So, some steps are being taken from the government level, and as was discussed during the week 10, are likely to create positive impacts towards the overall water governance. The week 11 was focused towards the discussion over water dispute management. So, discussions were centered on the basic reasons of the dispute, basic types of the dispute, like the disputes typically could be at multiple levels, or multiple factors can trigger the disputes, which could be social factors, economic factors, political factors, and diplomatic reasons. Now, it is not necessarily that dispute arises due to any one of these. There is possibility of multiple factors triggering a dispute. So, in such cases also this type of disputes become much more complicated as well, and under such disputes water can serve as a cause for the dispute, or as a tool, or as a target. So, water is used as a tool or target also and as was discussed during the week 11, that the military or terrorist activities can actually target water, or can use water services as a tool to sort of attack. Water disputes arises at multiple level, from local to global scale. So, it could be local disputes, regional disputes, national disputes, or global disputes. In terms of smaller water disputes could arise between farmers, villages, cities, towns, industries, and state departments could involve, while there are major disputes which often arises between the government and public at times over the development projects, could arise between different states or between even different nations. The disputes up to state level are generally resolved by the local authorities or judiciary, while the interstate water dispute resolution is under the jurisdiction of the central government under Article 262. So, this central government actually passed a Interstate Water Dispute Act in 1956 to consider the issues or disputes, and as per this dispute, it basically empowered the government to constitute a tribunal where generally 3% tribunal was recommended with one chairman and 2 other members, which could be the judges from the Supreme Court or High Court, and the decision of tribunal was supposed to be final and binding on all parties. This act was basically key in dealing several interwater disputes in India, including the more popular Kaveri dispute, Krishna dispute, or all such Narmada. So, some of the case studies were also discussed with Kaveri dispute discussions in the detail during week 11. There was some issues with the act which was tried to basically improvise through a interstate water dispute amendment bill which was tabled in the Lok Sabha last year. It has still not come as a regulation though, but the bill introduces quite a few things involving the possibility of amicable resolution through negotiation using a dispute resolution committee, or apart from that it proposes a single standing tribunal instead of multiple tribunals which are earlier act. For each dispute a separate tribunal was being constituted, while this bill proposes a single standing tribunal with one chairman and 6 other members, and it could have a multiple benches of this tribunal though, and also appointment of assessors, technically assessors which would be of the level of chief engineer or higher working in the central water institutes. So, that was another point which was added for providing technical support to the tribunal, because earlier tribunal was made of the judges only. So, interdisciplinary approach was missing, and it also tries to limit the time for decision making as 2 year, which could maximum be extended by 1 year, because earlier tribunals have taken ample amount of time over around 10 or 15 or even higher than that time for giving the decisions or award. So, that was the discussions during week 11, and this week's discussion, the week 12 discussions were targeted on global water diplomacy, where we saw the status of the world, where almost roughly 40% of world population from 145 different nations are dependent onto the transboundary river, lake and basins. So, there are around 263 transboundary lakes and river basins which covers nearly half of the earth's surface, more than 60% of the total rainfall, total runoff in fact goes to these transboundary rivers. The disparities between riparian countries in terms of economic development, institutional capacity, infrastructure and political orientation often give rises to the multilateral or bilateral disputes. While there has been conflicts related to the water in a few international basins, there are many shared basins which have been amicably able to resolve the disputes and handle them with diplomatic cooperation. So, nations usually value these agreement in the form of treaties, and sort of as they make their international relations better and more stable. So, the history of water cooperation is very old, and earlier it was targeted onto the navigation treaties. All the treaties and negotiations were targeted more so onto the navigation, whereas in the last century this target has shifted from navigation more towards the development, protection and conservation of water resources. So, that is the opportunity for cooperation between the different nations. Now, in last 50 years there has been around only 37 acute cases of dispute, 37 cases of disputes having violence and all that, as was reported by the United Nations, while there has been around 150 treaties which has been signed. So, that suggests that the cooperation treaties are more dominant over the disputes, and the major part of the international waters are being treated with more so towards the cooperation rather than the disputes. We did discuss some of the prime dispute and prime water disputes on international waters, and some of the treaties or some of the international agreements which have basically served in this manner, in this factor. These cooperation treaties have survived conflict between nations over other issues as well, as the India and Pakistan have faced several wars. Still your Indus Water Treaty has survived, and there are few other examples on that. There are various international water institutions which looking after various aspects related to the freshwater or marine water, and United Nations have also contributed in form of a resolution on the law of transboundary aquifers and a yet to ratify convention on the law of the non-navigational uses of the international water course. So, these are the guiding documents that promote the cooperation on the international waters in a amicable fashion. It also intends to provide a platform to promote cooperation and coordination of activities for the member states and the partners in the area of transboundary water management. So, that were the states sort of efforts from the United Nations. So, these were the basic discussion or major discussion that took place in this week over the global water diplomacy, and that way we sort of conclude the summary of the discussions held in every week. Well, this is the last of this course, and I thank all of you who basically enrolled for this course, who have been with us over the period of 12 weeks, have gone through the lectures, have participated in the forum activities or writing the exam for certificate. I hope that we have been able to deliver the content as was the expected, as was the promised, towards the enlightening and making aware and equipped with the approaches which are there in the sector of water economics and governance. And with this I thank you all, and please still be active on forum, post anything that comes your mind or any point of discussion or any question in the forum, and we will be able to we will be able to answer it there. So, thank you all for joining, and wish you the very best of the career and very best of the future ahead. Thank you.